Growing and maturing in life is about growing out of unhelpful ways of being and responding and into more helpful, more mature, more stable, more grounded ways of being and responding. So it's important that as CBT practitioners or as aspiring CBT practitioners, we check ourselves first. We give ourselves a good checkup from the neck up. We check ourselves before we wreck ourselves or wreck other people through the process, which I'm sure we don't want to do. So this is a framework that helps us to identify a healthy end. All right, if we want to go on a journey in life, and we're all going to have a starting point, but we've always got to start with the end in mind. Because if we don't have an end destination, then we're going to find it quite difficult to gauge how effective we're being along the way. Does that make sense? Well, in the same way, when working with clients, they're going to come to us off a certain level of maturity, and it's understanding this framework that allows us to monitor and gauge how it is that our clients are growing through their time spent with us. Does that make sense? So I want to share with you a worst case scenario, all right? If you've ever come across or met a totally disempowered person in life, they will be off a victim mindset. All right, now to give you an example here, me and Karen, we live in a place called Dunfermline here in Scotland. And just on the weekend, we went and we spent the weekend in Edinburgh. Now, Edinburgh is a beautiful city, it really is. But over the last few years, we've really noticed an increase in the number of men and women who sit on street corners begging for change. They have signs. Now, this isn't about tearing anyone down, but there's one guy who I bumped into maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, this guy was ex-military, and he would sit outside one of the Starbucks cafes with a sign saying, I'm ex-military, I'm down on my luck, could you spare some change so that I can get a room in a hostel tonight? Me being me, I felt compelled to help the guy out, so I think I took about 20 or 30 pounds out of my wallet, handed it and said, right, go and get yourself some accommodation for the night, and that was it. And I hadn't seen him for a few years, but me, whilst I don't always remember names, I never forget a face. And on the weekend, just gone, I saw the guy sitting there, except he'd found a new spot. He was sitting outside of the train station now. Obviously, he got a far higher footfall, just with a better sign and a better jacket. And he was just slightly more effective at being completely disempowered. Now, whether the guy still believed himself to be a victim or not, goes without saying. I think that in Edinburgh, especially throughout tourist season, sitting with a sign playing the victim card can be quite financially lucrative. What I'm saying here is that the victim mindset is actually quite an appropriate mindset for some people to develop. It depends on the level of dependency that they want to integrate into their relationships. When an individual is 100% fully focused on taking responsibility for all aspects of their life, the victim mindset has absolutely no place in our lives or in their lives. However, in any aspect of life that we haven't yet taken full responsibility for, well, that means that we're going to be waiting for someone else to take responsibility for us. And therefore, we deem ourselves completely disempowered in this life area. All right, so what I'm not doing here, I would not be willing to undermine or dismiss anyone's situation, anyone's circumstances, or anyone's past history. But by now, I'm hoping that you're starting to see that, whilst some people experience some tough stuff, whilst some people experience some quite harsh experiences in life, it is still down to us to choose and determine how we respond. We either respond as victims or we respond as victors. We each get to decide. So CBT has got to be about us as men and women helping other people to identify the areas of their life that are serving them and serving them well, that they're obviously taking responsibility for, and those areas that they perhaps haven't yet taken responsibility for. If a person is feeling sad or crushed or depressed or anxious or stressed about a certain aspect of their life, this would generally lead me to question how much responsibility they've actually taken for this aspect of their life. Because when a person is fully owning a certain aspect of their life, well, they're owning the change that they want to see happen. So when a person is feeling crushed by this life aspect, it's because they perhaps don't yet have a vision for how they can grow and improve and develop in this life area. So the victim mindset walks hand in hand with sadness, with disempowerment, apathy, indifference. It's kind of like this I lose mindset. I'm a victim of circumstance. I'm a victim of society. Mummy dropped me on my head when I was young. Daddy never gave me enough cuddles. And it's all the reasons why our lives have worked out the way that they have done. It's kind of like we are disempowered and unable to do anything about it, which obviously completely contradicts the core assumptions of CBT. But we've got to understand how it is that we can identify what mindset people are operating out of. Before we come on to understanding the tools and the various techniques and questioning processes that we can use to facilitate change in people's thinking, we've got to identify where people are starting at. All right? So worst case scenario, our clients or those people that we work with will be operating out of a victim mindset, which is obviously going to be a mindset of complete disempowerment. So, moving up the ladder, right, that's worst case scenario, by the way. What I'm going to suggest is that when a person is ready to change, they enter into a state of conflict. Call this inner conflict. Now, I'll give reference to my own life. Back when I think I must have been around about 26 or 27 years old. I think that was probably the age where I started taking responsibility for my life in areas that I previously hadn't done. So I mentioned that I joined the army at the age of 17. I left at the age of 24, and being between the ages of 24 and 26 for the few years through this kind of military to civilian life transition, I struggled, as many ex-military guys and girls do. Why? Because in the military, all I had to do was just simply do what I was told. I had a certain time where I had to get out of bed in the morning. I had orders to follow. I was given commands. I had a hierarchy. I had officers and sergeants. And all I ever had to do was just obediently do as I was told, which meant that in many areas of my life, I didn't actually have to think for myself whatsoever. So in terms of, traveling overseas, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, places like that, yes, sometimes the work was quite arduous, quite physically demanding, but not particularly mentally challenging or thought-invoking, because all I ever had to do was just simply what I was told. And outside of work, I had my accommodation paid for, my bills were paid, all that came out of my wages before I was paid. So in the couple of years after leaving, you've got to understand that there was areas of my life that I'd never previously taken responsibility for. And it was actually in those areas that I found myself really growing in conflict. I was angry at society. Society should be providing me with a solution for this aspect of my life. It's kind of like I'm entitled to something here. And if you look at how many people you know in your life who operate from this attitude of entitlement, this is all to be found in this conflict mindset where we're contemplating change. We might be thinking about changing something, but we're perhaps still waiting for someone to come into our life and do all the change for us because we haven't yet learned at this stage of our development that unless we change something, then nothing will change. All right? So when a person's operating out of a conflict mindset, what you'll generally identify in their demeanour and in their attitude is anger. If you've ever come across an angry person, it's because they're in a place of conflict. Inner conflict, they want to change something, but most likely at the moment haven't yet learned a strategy or don't yet know how to. And this is a fantastic place for us to step in as cognitive behavioural therapies. It can sometimes be quite difficult working with people who are operating and functioning out of the victim mindset, because many people who are operating in here haven't yet made a decision to change, all right? And as with all things, until a person's made a decision to change and has actually taken action or has started to take action, then sometimes, change might not actually happen at all. But when a person's operating from a place of conflict, well, they want to change, they're ready to change, but perhaps just don't yet know how to, or what direction they should perhaps start traveling in. And this is when we can start really coming alive. When a client starts becoming defiant, they want to start breaking the rules. So this is how I've always been, or this is the way in which I've always lived life, but I don't want to live this way anymore. You'll find this sometimes with a lot of teenagers, won't you? You know, perhaps teenagers who are 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. I mean, maturity these days isn't really so much to do with age, it's more to do with acceptance of responsibility. So as soon as a person is ready to take responsibility for themselves, well, they're actually ready to start growing and maturing. But this does send people into this place of conflict, because this is all about transition. It's about transitioning out of a place of irresponsibility and into a place of responsibility. Are you with me? Which can sometimes be quite hard. And when a person is going through this place of conflict, sometimes everyone else, especially loved ones, the closest, the nearest and the dearest, can become the bad guys. There's a pretty good chance you've experienced that, or you can relate to that in some way. So obviously, when a person is in this place of conflict, the only direction that they're able to travel in is one of responsibility. Now here's the thing. When a person takes responsibility for an aspect of their life, they become automatically empowered to start changing. Now, I'm not saying that we can all take responsibility for every single aspect of our lives all of the time. Sometimes we do need a person to come along to give us a little bit of guidance or point us in the right direction. Sometimes we need someone in our lives who's going to really challenge and provoke us to think differently or look at life differently, to really challenge and confront our sometimes unhelpful perspectives. And this is something that we'll really come alive in doing as CBT practitioners. But when a person takes responsibility for their life and starts changing, any conflict or anger that came about throughout the season of conflict generally gets forgiven. All right? Why? Because when a person takes responsibility for changing, they become automatically more empowered through the process. If you think about it, we only ever really rebel and get angry when we feel like we're being controlled, or like someone's trying to control us, or when a person is giving us unsolicited advice, or is trying to think for us, when we actually really do genuinely want to take responsibility for ourselves in this area. I mean, many young people do this. How many young people do you know these days who just love being on the receiving end of advice? Well, I don't know too many, all right? The only time, in fact, I will ever offer anyone some advice is if I'm asked for it. And when a person comes to me saying, Kane, what do you think I should do? Right? I'll never say, well, I think you should do this, or I think you should do that. Why? Because what I would do is always going to be subjective to my own frame of reference, all right? So what I will generally do if a person asks me for advice, I will let them know what I would do if I was in the same or a similar situation, but that the choice is ultimately always down to them to take responsibility for making. All right? And I really want to impress this upon you, that as a CBT practitioner, our goal should always be to encourage our clients or those people that we're working with to take responsibility for making decisions and taking action. Even if the actions that they're taking or the decisions that they're making aren't even that helpful, it can still aid a client in growing in empowerment. If they make a mistake and then another mistake and then learn through the process that they haven't died yet and that they aren't actually any worse off, then for some clients, this can just give them the confidence that they need to continue to keep on making more decisions and taking more actions. All right. What was the Thomas Edison approach to life? Well, he was the guy that invented the light bulb, wasn't he? Apparently, he'd invented 1,000 light bulbs that didn't work before he invented the one light bulb that did. But he never gave up, and today the world can see in the dark because of Thomas Edison's work. All right, so let us not undermine the power of just simply making decisions and taking action, even if they don't seem to be leading us anywhere in the short term. Responsibility generally comes about through collaborative relationships. All right, and if we can go back, was it 2 videos ago, when I said that the nature of the CBT-based relationship is always going to be collaborative by nature. All right, 2 people working together, not one person advising, not one person fixing, but 2 people working together on shared goals or a shared purpose for a shared reason. So, in order for us to move forward in our future, we've got to make peace with the past. And this is generally where forgiveness comes into play. Do you know that sometimes in life, in order for us to really become effective in our decision-making endeavours, we've got to actually make peace with and forgive ourselves for being imperfect in the past. Now that might sound like a pretty abstract, crazy idea, but how many people do you know who live today in the world and do nothing, who go round and round and round in circles, fearful of making decisions because they know that they are imperfect? How many people do you know who beat themselves up, are of low self-esteem? And if you ask them why they have low confidence or low self-esteem, they'll say, well, I'm not good in this area. I'm not good looking enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not clever enough. I'm not skilled enough. I'm not this enough. I'm not that enough. We could replace all of these not enoughs with I am imperfect. All right? And it's kind of like sometimes the main person that we need to forgive in life is ourselves for not being perfect. But in the same way that you never gave birth to you, I never gave birth to me. I don't know about you, but I certainly never asked to be born. Well, I can't remember being, asked to be born anyway. And in the same way, most people don't, which means we're all brought into the world by other imperfect people, which means that us being imperfect, well, we're kind of doomed to living a life of imperfection right from the start. So when we can just make peace with this, forgive the imperfect parents that we had for making us imperfect, and then we can forgive ourselves for being imperfect, then we can then start committing to a life of just simply being better, all right? Now, this might sound like a really abstract idea, but it can be quite an empowering one. Think about the main reasons why people don't change in life, because they believe that they can't change. They're not smart enough, not skilled enough, not this enough, not that enough. But why many people don't change is because they don't believe that they're going to be able to get the outcomes or ascertain or accomplish or achieve the goals that they ultimately want to see fulfilled in their lives. But when our goal is just simply to grow or to improve or be better, then progress becomes more progressive. It doesn't have to be a destination. It can just simply be a process instead, which becomes far more empowering for people on this journey. But all starts with us forgiving ourselves for being imperfect individuals, all right? If you do have a problem forgiving yourself for being imperfect, well, how are you ever going to be able to connect in the most engaging and meaningful way with other people when everyone else in the world is also equally as imperfect as you? All right? Sometimes we've got to learn how to relate to ourselves more effectively before we start relating to other people more effectively. So here's the thing. We're kind of experiencing a little bit of sadness here, some sadness here or some anger here, something like that. Responsibility can be trialing, it can be challenging, especially if we're now starting to take responsibility for an area of our life that we've never taken responsibility for before in the past. Another example here, probably up until the age of 30 or 31, I had never, ever taken responsibility for myself in terms of the area of personal finances. So any money that I'd had in the past, it would come and it would go. It was kind of like I'd receive money in one hand and it would go in the other. Now, I always wanted to, be able to afford a nice home, a nice family home, a nice car, not because I was a materialistically driven kind of person, but just because it's nice to have those things in life. But because I'd never taken full responsibility for managing my personal finances well, I'd never been able to afford these things. Sometimes I would have lots of money, and if I was making lots of money, I would spend lots of money. And then I would then reach another stage or season of life where I was then absolutely broke because I'd spent everything that had come in. And it was only when I took responsibility for budgeting, for building the principle of percentages into my life. And by this I meant, every single month, if £1,000 came in, 10% would go into savings, 10% would go into an investment fund, around about 60 or 70% would go towards bills, then left me maybe 20% for spending on whatever I wanted to. What it meant was that every single month, it didn't really matter what came in. I could always see increase in the savings and in my investment pot. So I could always see increase, even if it didn't seem like I was making more every single month. Now, that's not perhaps the greatest of examples, but it was only when I took responsibility for this area of my life that my investment pot grew that allowed me to invest more. And as I invested more, I then started generating more. Now, I'm just talking finances here, but that's just one example of taking responsibility for an aspect of our lives. And when we take responsibility for an aspect of our lives that we previously haven't taken responsibility for, we become empowered in this area.